Paul communicates his philosophy of ministry in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, and he says that he becomes all things to all people that he might save some. And he says that he does it all for the sake of the gospel. See, Paul is God's, ultimate cross-cultural missionary, church planter, and he best engages his culture. And so when I think about someone that I met, I was in Boston once, and this planter, I asked him where he's from. He said he was from South Carolina. And I was stunned. I said, did you grow up there? And I was stunned because he didn't have an accent. And I said, what happened to your southern accent? Because I'm a North Carolinian. And he says this, I got a voice coach when I first moved here, and to get rid of my southern accent. Man, you talk about someone being all things to all people so that he can reach people for Christ. This is so critical as we think about who we're trying to reach. Instead of just thinking about who we are, we need both. We need to understand the culture around us. I love bringing interns and church plant residents into our church that come from all white backgrounds or all black or black and white contexts. And they come into our church that is multi-ethnic like our church. They don't know how to completely navigate. I love taking them to Costco and for them just to observe all the nations and tribes that are there shopping, right? And then to open their ears and hear all the tongues, the foreign languages that they're not accustomed to. I love taking them to the basketball court in the center of my community, and they will be the only white guy that's American born on the courts when there are 25 plus people. They'll actually first experience what it seems to be a minority in this diverse context. And so we need to think about how can we become all things to all people. And so the thing that we value most is this. We definitely value biblical and theological IQ, but also on the other hand, we need to raise cultural IQ of God's people, right? And so that's taking truth and contextualizing it so they can live it out. And that's our responsibility of discipling this next generation of church planters and disciple makers to raise their cultural IQ so that they can engage the culture well, just as Jesus intended. And so if you may be wondering, well, I'm not a minority. I'm just a plain white guy, right? How am I going to reach this diverse community that God's called me to? You don't have to necessarily reflect like your skin color or ethnicity to reach a certain people group, okay? We have to be careful not to appropriate culture, but to appreciate culture. And so when I go to Costco, and there's a greeter there, and I asked him where he was from. He told me Tunisia, and as soon as he said that, I started speaking to him in Francais. Right? And so every time I walk in and see this greeter, I say, bonjour, monsieur, ça va? In his native tongue. I'll take my son, Derek, who's when he was an elementary student, and I would talk to him and others working at the store, when they say, what country are you from? And they would answer, and I said, Derek, do you know what's the capital of that country? And I said, do you know what countries border that? Do you know what language they speak? And we would have a conversation, and these men and women will be so thrilled. Wow, you know my people, you know my country. That's appreciation, not appropriation. This is how we raise cultural IQ in God's people, and so that they can be all things to all people. It also means understanding vices and virtues and idols in the culture, the things that they make a priority in their lives. If you think about, for instance, Asian Americans, right, place so much emphasis on education, honor, those kind of things. And so we need to understand vices, virtues, and idols and be able to speak the gospel to them. Building a church that impacts the community is not so much about programming as it is mobilizing. And so the Apostle Paul, he was driven by passion to reach people with the gospel. And as a result, he was willing to become all things to all people, understanding different cultures and how to navigate through those, because he was thinking exponentially. We need to think about the how of church planning. It's determined by the who, the when, and the where, the culture, and the foundation is already set through biblical ecclesiology. And so there are different types of people that God has brought into your context. And these are the people that we're called to reach. And so we must think different people, different contexts, and how do we best contextualize ourselves, our church. And it's going to take time to know the place well. And to be a missionary is to love the people through the best way that they can be loved. So one of the ways that All People's Community Church contextualizes is that we will pray in other foreign languages, we'll read scripture in other languages, we will sing songs, maybe not necessarily the entire song, but songs in other languages. And so I had a brother come up to me. He grew up in a Peruvian American home. He was born in the States, but his parents were born in Peru. And so we joke around all the time because we have a Korean American in our church that speaks better Spanish than him. But Victor came up to me after service and he says, that song that we sang in Spanish, it really hit me. I didn't think it would hit me in that way because I don't really speak Spanish. But it was his heart language. And so that's one of the ways that we contextualize on Sunday mornings. So your story and your context may be completely different than what mine is. And so I want to speak to you and how do you navigate through that? And so for me, I grew up in Greensboro, North Carolina, but I was born in Osaka, Japan. And at the age of 6, I moved into this city that was half black, half white. Grew up in a white neighborhood. By God's grace, we were bused into a black neighborhood. And so I didn't know if I was white or black. I was just navigating through both cultures that I could identify easily with both of these cultures. And I was a third culture kid. And so you may have to learn how to navigate and live and understand the culture that is on one side of the tracks and also on the other side of the tracks. And that's simply being a foreigner, that your citizenship is in heaven and that you don't have to place your identity in your ethnicity or your place of origin or where you grew up, and definitely not your skin color, but your identity as a child of God, citizen of heaven. We can reach all people. See, the Apostle Paul was driven by the gospel. That was his motivation, that he wanted to reach all peoples, all nations and tribes, and he was willing to become all things to all people. He wanted to see an exponential movement of the gospel, not just one church or a few churches, but gospel movement. And that's our hope as well, that we're thinking gospel movement because we will contextualize and then we will become all things to all people.